Hi, my name is Rich Frankel. I'm the author of OneWorldEconomics.com, a website dedicated to exploring the issues of globalization with an emphasis on the United States. This is one of a series of videos I'm preparing to share my results. This one is about income and wealth inequality today and a suggestion for how the U.S. could achieve better income equality. If you're interested in more details and sources, head over to OneWorldEconomics.com. I hope you find this video informative. So first we'll take a look at world productivity and income. Uh, the first thing I noticed when I looked at the world economy is how integrated it is and how we're all tied together by trade and sustainability issues. So here, if you look at trade, trade is 50% of the average country's GDP. In the United States, it's 25% of our GDP and 33% in China. That doesn't mean it's actually 25% of GDP. It means the size of trade, incoming and outgoing trade, is 25% of the GDP, so enormous. World trade is over 30.5 trillion, which is larger than the US GDP. We're also tied together by sustainability issues. The world's population has grown to over 8 billion and is predicted to reach 11 billion before leveling out. As people in developing countries achieve higher incomes, they buy more meat, and we're already using 75% of our cropland to grow food for livestock. If demand for meat continues to grow, which it will, we will need more cropland than there's arable land on Earth. And of course, we all know about climate change, which affects everybody. It doesn't matter whether CO2 is produced in Taipei or in Texas, it affects both countries. This is a chart of world shipping in real time. This is a snapshot from one of the many companies that tracks ships. And as you can see, these are the continents, and these are the oceans, and these are all the super tankers and container ships that are going around the world at one particular point in time to move that $30 trillion worth of goods. Shipping took off because of lowering shipping costs and computerized logistics. That was the main factor, was that the fact that shipping costs lowered considerably. Productivity gains have made the rich world rich. This chart shows GDP per person. GDP measures the value of all output produced for final sale in a country. This chart shows growth in inflation-adjusted dollars set to 2011 prices, so the numbers would all be higher in 2023 dollars. The chart also uses international dollars, which are further adjusted for local purchasing power. GDP per person is a good way to measure the income of a country, and I should also explain that per capita GDP and overall productivity are much the same thing. Productivity measures the output per work hour. So, as you can see, there's been a tremendous increase in productivity and output per person in what are called the Western offshoots, the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Part of this is due simply to the incredible productivity increases in agriculture. Back in 1820, it took 80% of the population to grow the food that the nation needed. It's now less than 1% in the United States that are actually involved in agriculture directly. So that's an enormous increase. You can imagine how much the increase in agricultural productivity has been. And then, of course, we had the Industrial Revolution and automation and all that other stuff since then. Other countries have taken a lot longer to get going here. Sub-Saharan Africa, China has just come up, as you can see, enormously in the last few decades. You also have to remember that GDP per person is influenced by population growth rate. So if the population growth rate is higher, it tends to eat up increases in GDP. The developing countries are still far poorer than the rich countries. Half the people in the world live on less than $7.50 per day, and that's in U.S. purchasing power because this is international dollars. U.S. GDP per person was over $80,000 per year in 2023. China's GDP per person is $12,500 per year. Mexico's is $13,000. Many countries have a GDP below $1,000 per person, so obviously nobody, on the average, people can't make more than $1,000. How is it possible for people to live on $7.50 per day in U.S. purchasing power? Basically, they're outside the official economy. They live in very, very crude housing with no glass windows, and they do subsistence farming in order to make ends meet. They're basically outside the official economies. This chart shows on the right that in developing countries have increased their output per person enormously since 1990. China now has almost 12 times the real output per person it did in 1990. But the chart on the left here shows you that, in fact, the China's GDP per person has gone up by this brown amount here in terms of dollars. So even though the percent is very high, the growth rate is percent, they started from a very low base. So China's growth since 1990 in dollars per person is roughly the same as Germany's and is less than the United States. So, in terms of what's called convergence, with the poorer countries catching up, they still have a long way to go. And it all depends on the growth rate. If the growth rate can be kept up, China's growth rate has slowed slightly. You may also notice on this chart the enormous GDP growth per capita in Ireland. And that's almost entirely due to Ireland becoming a leprechaun economy, as somebody has called it. They have become a tax shelter country, and a lot of big companies, including big US companies like Apple, have parked their profits there in order to avoid taxation. So this shows the income inequality between countries. Um, as you can see, some of the poorest countries in the world, with the Congo with having less than $1,000 per person in GDP per year, and then some of the higher uh, countries like the U.S. at $66,000 per person in GDP per year. Brazil 14,000, Australia 54,000, China 14,000, France 44,000. So you can see there's an enormous disparity between $1,000 in output per year per person and $66,000 per year in output. And again, these are in 2017 international dollars. Not all these numbers will agree across different data sets because of the different ways that dollars are measured. So income inequality is high between countries, but it's also high within countries. So we saw that a lot of the African countries were very poor, but they also have fairly high concentrations of income within the country. But so does the United States. In the United States, between 40 and 50%, it's closer to 50% of the national income goes to the top 10%. Um, Income inequality within the country is very high in South Africa and in Mexico. It's somewhat lower in Australia and Canada and in Europe, where it's 30 to 40% of national income going to the top 10%. And then it's the lowest in the Scandinavian countries and Iceland, where it's under 30%. The red line in this chart shows the ratio of the top 10% income to the bottom 50% income. Okay, so you can see it's always been high. The rich, the top 10% has, nearly 16 times, like 15, 16 times the income of the bottom 50%. And this was all the case from 1820 up to like 1920, the roaring 20s. And then after the war, income inequality fell a bit, and then it's been creeping back up since 1980. Okay, that's income inequality around the world within countries. Now, between country inequality started off pretty low before industrialization and the mechanization of agriculture. Everybody was pretty poor, everybody worked in agriculture. And then, as the West and Europe industrialized and agriculture became mechanized, the difference in income, between different countries grew and grew and grew until it was really, really high here in 1980. And then China and some other countries in the world started industrializing and becoming more productive. And it's going down and will continue to go down. So income inequality is really high, but wealth inequality is even higher worldwide. This chart shows different regions around the world, and it shows median wealth versus mean wealth. Mean wealth is also called average wealth. So median wealth means that in North America, Canada, and the United States, half the households have wealth of $100,000 and up, and half the households have less than $100,000 in wealth. But the mean wealth, the average wealth, means that if you took all the wealth and divided evenly between households, all households would have like $650,000 in wealth. So the difference between the brown area and the dark gray area tells you how skewed wealth is. Sorry, wealth is extremely skewed in the United States. There's a fairly small number of people that have most of the wealth. Another indication of that skewed nature of wealth is something called the Gini coefficient. That's these numbers along here. The Gini coefficient ranges from 0, where wealth is completely equally distributed, to 100, where one person literally owns all the wealth in the country. So you can see 84 is much closer to the 100 side of things than it is the 0 side of things. The light blue area shows you the population of these various regions of the world. So the United States and Canada are, part of the world population, but not a huge part of it. Goes up. Europe, with less wealth, has, a larger population. China, with an even larger population, less wealth. Asia Pacific, which has as much as China and India, not combined, but about as much as China and India, has a very high population and fairly low wealth. And as you can see, the median wealth is very low in these countries. So to summarize, income inequality between countries rose during the 20th century with industrialization in the West, but it's now slowly declining as countries develop. Income inequality within countries, including the US, is very high. Wealth inequality is far more concentrated in income. Half of the world's net wealth belongs to the top 1%. The top 10% of adults hold 85%, while the bottom 90% hold the remaining 15%. So now let's look at U.S. income and wealth inequality. So U.S. income inequality has risen since Reagan's time. As you can see, after the war, the middle class boomed following the reforms and the high marginal tax rate brought in by the New Deal. And so this was the heyday of the middle class in the United States. Then around Reagan's time, tax rates were dropped, unions were actively attacked, and the top 10% part of income grew and grew and grew. So this growth in the top 10% pre-tax income from about 35% to about 50% represents about $2.3 trillion a year in 2023. Meanwhile, the bottom 50%, this is the bottom 50%, had about 20% of national income back in Reagan's day, and now they have about 10% of national income. So again, that fell, like $2 trillion plus. Now again, that's pre-tax. So income for most has not kept pace with economic growth. As you can see, net national income, this is income when you take out the expenses needed to keep business going, such as depreciation and so on and so forth. This is actual disposable income pre-tax, has continued to go up since the 1964, 1980, so on and so forth. But the average non-supervisory hourly pay, including benefits, which have gone up a bit, has not grown that much. And this is for everybody who's in a non-supervisory position. So it includes, some professionals and so on. So you can imagine that for some lower paid workers, it hasn't gone up hardly at all. So simply put, a rising tide lifts all boat, or the trickle down economics simply hasn't happened for most people. Almost half of American workers are low wage. This is something that really shocked me when I was doing my research. In 2019, 53 million people, 44% of America's workers, were low wage, with median hourly wages of $10.22 and a median annual earnings of about $18,000. These numbers come from a Brookings Institution study. Low wage workers switch jobs most frequently but are more likely to churn within a set of low wage occupations. Mobility is lousy for low income workers, which pretty much says the same thing. You basically can't get ahead. 37% of Americans can't afford an expense of over $400 without borrowing, and 62% of Americans don't have a college degree. And this is just something we have to keep in mind when we're talking about the US economy. The Pew Research Center shows that the share of Americans in the middle class has fallen since 1971. Back in the early 70s, a fairly sizable majority of Americans were middle class. And by 2023, it was barely half of Americans were middle class. It's gone at both ends. So there are now more upper income people and also a somewhat increase in lower income people. The dividing line here is 2/3 of median income and twice median income to define the middle class. So this chart shows U.S. average household income by decile, by groups of 10%. These are standardized households, so they're the same size for all groups. This first group here, and this includes income transfers, so it includes government payments. This first group here, the lowest 10%, it's about $26,000 per household per year. And as you can see, it goes up fairly steadily here with each decile. And then this upper 10% is just completely out of proportion with everything else. All right. I showed here this little rectangle is a $10,000 amount on this chart. And if you took that $10,000, you put it down here on this lowest decile, household income would go from $26,000 to $36,000, so a substantial percentage increase. And here at this upper end, it would hardly be missed at all. But even with this top 10%, income is highly skewed, okay? So this shows the upper end of the income distribution. As you can see, the top 1% is just like completely out of proportion, even with the rest of the upper 10%. So this 10% bar here is pulled up by this enormously, because this is an average, is pulled up enormously by this top 1% and the top 1/10 of 1%. So as skewed as income distribution is, wealth distribution in the United States is even more skewed. 3 men really do own more than the bottom half of all Americans. So the top 1% owns about 1/3 of the wealth. Then the rest of the top 10% owns another third, a little more than a third. So the top 10% total has like more than 2/3 of the wealth. The middle class has the middle class here has about 1/3 of the wealth. Again, that's mostly in housing. And the bottom 50% owns virtually nothing. So what explains the increased income inequality since the 1970s? Is it trade, immigration, globalization, automation? Well, we have to remember that wages are determined by supply and demand, okay? That in any market economy, we have a market economy, labor wages are determined by supply and demand. Now, this is for any type of labor. So obviously it looks different for a laborer in a factory than it does for a plumber or for a doctor. But for any type of labor, the supply and demand for labor determines what the wages are. So if you're a factory owner, let's say, then you're going to want to use less labor as wages go up. And that's why this blue curve here, which is the demand for labor, goes down. So as wages are low, you're going to use more workers and less automation and machines and that sort of thing. And then as wages go up, you'll mechanize, use new machines, use automation to try to reduce your demand for labor. Okay. On the other hand, the supply of labor, when it goes up, when wages go up, the supply of labor increases. So the curve there goes up. So if that factory owner offers more dollars in wages, then more people will apply. And so where the factory owner is willing to pay exactly enough to meet his needs in terms of workers, that's where the pay ends up. So the wages end up here, let's say at $22 an hour. Now, anything that decreases the demand for labor, like automation or competition or something like that, anything that decreases the demand for labor will cause wages to fall. Or anything that increases the supply of labor will cause wages to rise. Right? So technology, trade, and immigration can all affect the demand for or supply of different types of labor. Well, globalization and trade in particular gets a bum rap. Okay, this shows the percentage of employees in manufacturing in different fully developed countries. Um, and as you can see, Germany, which is a super powerhouse of trade, it has the largest trade surplus in terms of dollars, not even percentage, in the world, and is a total manufacturing powerhouse. Their percent of employees in manufacturing has gone down, 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 down. Okay. And the same thing happened in the United States and in Britain and in Australia and in Canada. Um, so the demand for labor in manufacturing has simply declined compared to the rest of the economy. I put in NAFTA here. This is when NAFTA happened. This is when China was admitted into the World Trade Organization and China's trade really blossomed. As you can see, this didn't make a ripple in this decline in the percent of employees in manufacturing. So the main cause is automation. In the United States, manufacturing employment fell by 30% between 1990 and 2020. That's just at the end of this thing, even as real dollar output increased by over 70%. So it's automation and technology change. They simply do not need as many people now to manufacture as much as we used to. And that's, like agriculture. Agriculture used to be 80% of the population, now it's 1%. Okay. Nobody blames trade for that because we have a trade surplus in agriculture. Trade caused changes in what we manufacture and employment dislocations, but it drastically reduced many prices. Overall, the effect of trade is to reduce prices. With record high employment now, no jobs have been lost, actually. Some workers were hurt by imports, but markets have now adjusted. So let me give you an example of the clothing industry. It was decimated by the imports of clothing from low-wage countries. But in 1960, the average American household spent over 10% of their budget a year on clothing. By 2013, the average household was spending 3.5% of their budget on clothing, despite buying far more clothes. They bought like twice or three or four times as many clothes. That represents a saving of over $2,200 per year per household just on clothing. Now, the clothing workers found new jobs, but some of them may have lost income. Still, if you added up that $2,200 per household across the entire United States, that would have well made up the difference for the clothing workers, what they lost in wages from their new jobs to their old jobs, if anything. Okay. So people forget that trade is enormously effective in reducing costs and prices. Economic theory and real world studies show that trade always increases overall productivity and hence real income per capita. The problem is distribution of that income, as we're talking about now. Studies confirm that neither trade nor immigration has anywhere near the labor effects of technology change, automation, and the increased use of capital on shifting the demand for labor. And we'll see more of that with AI now. Let's talk about immigration next. Immigration economic effects. The United States has the most immigrants of any country, but not the most as a percent. 20% of Canadian, 21% of Canadians are foreign born, 20% in Sweden, 19% in Germany, and 15% in the United States. New immigrants compete in labor for certain jobs, which can bring down wages in those jobs. Usually, those jobs are competitive with earlier generations of immigrants or earlier recent immigrants. First generation immigrants are a net cost to their host communities, but second generation immigrants are substantial assets to the economy. What happens with immigrants is that over time they become just like everybody else. So basically, the economy expands. They create demand as well as, supply labor. So they become just part of the economy, as especially in second and third generations. Without immigrants, the workforce would shrink just as the elderly population is expanding. This would reduce the number of working people supporting each retiree. We're on track to get to the point where there are two or three working people supporting one retiree. So that is a problem. If you don't have enough working people, you have an elderly population that needs supporting. The flow of authorized immigrants into the country has remained fairly steady. The immigration laws were set back in the 1960s, in 1965, and by right, immigration is usually related to family members and that sort of thing. And those rules haven't changed at all substantially since 1960s. So, legal immigrants or authorized immigrants, there are about 1 million a year coming in. California has twice the number of immigrants per capita, followed by Texas. And as you know, California is an economic powerhouse, and Texas is no slouch either. Um, so immigrant surges can put pressure on local housing markets and other resources. We saw that with the surge under the Biden administration. These were immigrants who were seeking asylum in the United States. So they were not allowed in as permanent immigrants. They were allowed in on a temporary basis, but that still caused pressure on housing markets and other resources. Um, Unfortunately, there has been a lot of dislocations in the world. We're not the only country harboring a lot of disaster kinds of immigrants. Venezuela, in particular, has been sending a lot of immigrants into surrounding countries, and they now host far larger percentages of immigrants than the United States. So, if productivity is the main reason for downward pressure on labor in manufacturing and other kinds of goods producing activities, and productivity and national income has continued to rise, where has the money gone? Well, almost all the income since 1980 has gone to the top 10% and even more so to the top 1%, as we've seen. Corporate profits have increased from historic levels, and they flow through to the wealthy through dividends and capital gains. So that was a corporate philosophy, shareholder value, squeeze the employees and create more profits. And those profits flow through to those who own stock, and disproportionately the wealthy own stock. Taxes on the wealthy were drastically lowered under Reagan and Republican administrations since that time. So we not only saw more income flowing to the top, but also lower tax rates. And to make up the difference without cutting benefits, which would cause electoral losses, the result has been huge federal deficits. In the last administration, 1/3 of the federal deficit was made up through borrowing, and much of that borrowing is from foreigners and from rich Americans. That was necessitated by the fact that there were huge tax cuts under Trump and his first administration. Union busting has weakened labor bargaining power. This was an intentional process. There's a famous case where Tyson established, meatpacking plants in Texas to try to break the power of the meatpacking unions in Chicago, and they actually paid coyotes to bring in illegal immigrants to work in those plants. CEO pay has ballooned to a median $120 million a year, which is 250 times regular employee income. So, how do we fix income and wealth inequality? Case for a universal basic income in the United States. Inequality is a natural feature of market economics. That's not bad, it's not good, it's just a fact of life. Drastic income and wealth inequality is the historic norm, as we've seen looking back. Capitalist market economics tends to be very good at growing productivity, but market forces drive income and wealth concentration. Only governments can set the market terms for labor and through income transfer foster greater equality. FDR's New Deal and earlier reforms under Teddy Roosevelt limited work hours, set minimum pay standards, initiated high marginal income tax rates, and set up income transfer programs such as Social Security. And after those reforms, business boomed. It did not hurt business at all, including, all our private for-profit businesses. They grew just great because demand increased, and America's middle class grew. The New Deal reforms and taxes on the wealthy have been steadily attacked under Reagan, in particular. He reduced the top rate from 90% down to 28%, I believe it was, and following, Project 2025 aims to continue that attack. The capitalist market engine is not negatively affected by income transfers. So this takes a little thought here, but we need to separate out the idea of a capitalist market economy, which is a good driver of productivity growth, from income distribution, which is the income is the result of those operations. But who gets the income is not directly affecting the market economics. So let's take an example. The stock of General Motors is widely held, and its profits flow through to many shareholders. The operation of General Motors does not depend on how many shareholders there are. If General Motors had 3 shareholders and it distributed its profits to them, it would be exactly the same as if General Motors had 10 million shareholders and it distributed its profits to them. The operation of General Motors and its desire to make profits wouldn't change. So let's look at that example. If 3 wealthy men owned the stock of General Motors and all its profits flowed through to them, the taxing that income would have no effect on the operations of General Motors. Income transfers are not inherently anti-capitalist. Excessive inequality can erode social cohesion and reduce economic mobility, destabilizing capitalist society. Income transfers can help mitigate those effects. We can embrace both a capitalist market economy as the proven engine of growth and income transfers to reduce income and wealth inequality. So here's that chart again of U.S. average household income by decile. And there's that $10,000 that we could move from the upper 10% to the lowest 10%. But this also shows the red line here, which is the average gross national income of $144,673 per family, per household. That is how much everybody would have if all the income, net income, in the United States were divided equally between households. So somewhere in between this current structure and a structure where everything is equalized, we could achieve a better income distribution. We can afford a universal basic income. An annual universal basic income of $1,000 per month per adult would require an income transfer of about $2.5 trillion. So that would mean that every adult in the United States, working or not, would get $1,000 per month per adult. And that would require about 2.5 trillion because I'm excluding Social Security from that because Social Security is essentially a basic income as it is. If the share of national income going to the top 10% was the same now as when Reagan was elected, that group would have 2.3 trillion less annual gross income. That represents an income transfer from the bottom of 90% to the top. And the top wasn't poor before Reagan. I mean, there were lots of rich people before Reagan came into office. So, we wouldn't have to make rich people poor or even close to poor in order to gain a lot income that could be distributed more evenly. The 7,000-page U.S. tax code is riddled with tax breaks that favor the wealthy. Our current president, a billionaire, paid $750 in income taxes in 2016 and 2017, and none at all in 2020. So you get an idea of how badly screwed the income tax code is to allow something like that to happen. Tax exemptions lowered tax collections by over 1.7 trillion in 2023. We've also seen how much money gets sheltered in tax shelters like Ireland. In addition to legal tax breaks, the IRS estimates around 700 billion of illegal tax evasion annually. Much of that could be recovered with better enforcement. And if we had a UBI and universal basic income, it would reduce the need for means-tested programs, which would result in savings there as well. Why the UPI is better than other income transfer. A universal basic income has seen several trials, and the results have been highly positive. UBI leads paradoxically to increased employment, higher rates of business formation, and large improvements in life satisfaction. Not surprisingly, everyone would get the same UBI regardless of income. If you're a millionaire, you would still get your $1,000 a month UBI. So it's very fair and very easy to administer. Everybody gets it, so it's no problem administering it. U.S. lower income households often rely now on demeaning means-tested income transfer programs to make ends meet. This is especially true in rural areas. The need for such programs would be greatly reduced. A UBI of $1,000 per month per adult would end working poverty for the first time ever, but it would not be so large as to discourage work. So we're at a unique time in history where you've seen this enormous gain in productivity and output per person. We're at a unique time in history where there is enough to go around for everybody comfortably. We can all be middle class comfortably in the United States, except some of us would still be rich. Some prominent conservative economists favor a UBI because it doesn't distort markets and is simple to administer. That includes the arch conservative economist Milton Friedman and also Greg Menikow of Harvard. So the idea is that, people recognize that productivity has gotten to the point where there's no guarantee that labor will be paid enough to be equitable, okay? And so it's important that we distribute income in such a way that everybody participates in the economy. Worldwide income and wealth distribution are highly skewed to the upper end. That is true also in the US. The immense productivity increases of the 20th and 21st century mean that the US and other rich countries produce enough to provide an ample living for all citizens. That is probably a first in human history. Managed capitalism with free markets has driven productivity growth. It is used in almost every country in the world now, including China. So managed capitalism is a capitalist free market with controls to make sure that it doesn't go off the rails with crashes and over exorbitant booms. So like the Fed is part of the managed capitalism in the United States. Capitalism with free market places no value on more equal incomes and wealth. It's just not built in. It's an economic system that doesn't have any, there is no value to more equality. It doesn't care whether there's more equality or not. Although, of course, demand is better if distribution of income is more even. Wages are determined by supply and demand. Income, and especially wealth, tends to concentrate natively. Governments can and do use various means to support wages, including transfer some income from the rich to the poor. Governments can also set some terms for labor through minimum wages and standard work hours. Income transfers do not interfere with private ownership and management of firms. They have no effect on the capitalist market growth engine, except, of course, more evenly distributed income tends to increase demand, and so it tends to grow the economy. A universal basic income is an extremely efficient way of directly reapportioning income. Any allocation of income can be achieved and maintained over time, regardless of the vagaries of productivity growth. There is no excuse for working poverty and homelessness in the US. Universal basic income would let us all share in the benefits of economic growth. We would all truly have a stake in the country and an interest in its productivity growth. So, yes, if we all got money because we lived in the United States and because the United States was succeeding, we would be like all shareholders in the United States, and it would give us all a stake. And I think that would be great for social cohesion. If you have any thoughts about this, please get back to me, oneworldeconomics.com, and thank you very much.